This Bruce Lee video has been banned. You'll understand why when you watch it. There is a version of Bruce Lee's story that they want you to know. The polished, sanitized, Hollywood-approved version. The one where he shows up, kicks everyone in sight, makes a few movies, and dies under mysterious circumstances at 32. Clean, neat, contained. And then, there is the real version. The version that makes studio executives uncomfortable. The version that exposes how an industry built on telling stories spent years trying to silence one of the greatest stories it ever produced. The version where the most dangerous thing about Bruce Lee was not his fists, not his speed, not even that terrifying 1-inch punch that launched grown men across rooms. The most dangerous thing about Bruce Lee was what he believed, what he taught, what he represented to millions of people who had never been allowed to see themselves as powerful before. That version has been buried, softened, repackaged, and in some cases genuinely suppressed. And today, we are pulling all of it back up into the light. I want to be clear about something before we begin. This is not a video about conspiracy theories. There will be no shadowy ninjas, no ancient curses, no secret assassins in the rafters. Every single thing you are about to hear is rooted in documented history, credible first-hand accounts, and verified biographical research. Some of it will make you angry, some of it will make you deeply sad, and some of it will change the way you think about Bruce Lee forever. Let's start at the beginning. The real beginning. Part 1. The boy who was born into worlds and belonged to neither on November 27, 1940, in the hour of the dragon, between 6 and 8 in the morning. A baby boy was born at the Jackson Street Hospital in San Francisco's Chinatown. His father named him Yi Junfan, which translates roughly as return again. As if the family somehow knew this child would spend his entire life crossing borders that other people had decided he had no business crossing. His father, Li Huichun, was one of the most celebrated Cantonese opera singers in Hong Kong. The family was in San Francisco because Li Huichun was on an American tour with the Chinese Opera Company, performing for diaspora communities along the West Coast. The baby's mother, Grace Ho, was the grandniece of Sir Robert Ho Tung, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in Hong Kong. She was Eurasian, with European ancestry on her father's side and Chinese ancestry on her mother's, which would become something that complicated Bruce Lee's life in ways that are almost impossible to overstate. A nurse at the hospital gave the baby an English name, Bruce. His parents didn't really use it. To them he was Jun Fan, or as he would later become known on the streets of Hong Kong, Li Si Lung, the Little Dragon. When Bruce was 3 months old, his father's tour ended and the family returned to Hong Kong. And within months of their return, Japan invaded. Bruce Lee's earliest memories were of occupation, of Japanese warplanes flying low over the rooftops of Kowloon, of a city under the boot of a foreign power. His earliest memory of defiance, and this is entirely in character, was reportedly shaking his tiny fist at those planes as they passed overhead. He spent his childhood in Hong Kong's film industry, appearing in his first real role at age 6 in a film called The Beginning of a Boy. By the time he was 18, he had appeared in more than 20 films, including a co-starring role opposite his father in a 1950 production called The Kid. He was literally born into performance, but he was also becoming something else. At 12, Bruce started attending La Salle College and began spending time on the streets of Kowloon, gravitating toward a crowd of young men who ran with the gangs that controlled different corners of the city. The street fights started not long after. Bruce was getting into altercations constantly, rooftop brawls, alley confrontations, disputes that escalated with the particular velocity that only teenage boys seemed capable of. He was quick-tempered, proud, and restless in a way that his father recognized as dangerous. At 13, after being beaten up by a street gang, Bruce asked his mother for permission to study Kung Fu. She agreed, and he was introduced to a man who would become one of the defining influences of his life, Yip Man, the Grand Master of Wing Chun. Yip Man nearly refused him. There was a long-standing tradition in Chinese martial arts schools that the secrets of the style were to be kept within the community, not shared with outsiders. And Bruce's mother had European blood. Some of Yip Man's senior students objected strenuously to training someone with non-Chinese ancestry. It required a personal appeal from Bruce's friend, William Cheung, to get him through the door. And even once he was inside, most of the other students refused to spar with him when they learned of his background. But Yip Man trained him anyway, privately, directly, with far more personal attention than most students received, because Yip Man recognized something in the boy that most people around him had either not yet noticed or chosen to ignore, a quality of attention, of hunger, of sheer relentless focus that was unlike anything the old master had encountered. Bruce Lee trained with Yip Man from 1954 to 1959, 5 years of deep immersion in one of the most efficient and direct close combat systems ever developed. And yet, even within that school, even with that master, Bruce was already questioning, already examining the rules and wondering why they existed, already beginning the long intellectual journey that would eventually lead him somewhere no one in the martial arts world had ever gone before. The streets kept calling, though. The fights kept happening. In 1958, he knocked out a rival school's champion so decisively that it caused a significant enough incident for the police to become involved. His mother had to physically go to a police station and sign a document accepting full legal responsibility for his behavior. His father, seeing the trajectory things were taking, made a decision. He sent Bruce to America to claim his U.S. citizenship before the trouble he was creating in Hong Kong crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Bruce Lee left Hong Kong in 1959 with $100 in his pocket. He had no plan except to survive. Part 2. The secret fights they never wanted you to know about. Most people think of Bruce Lee's real fights as things of rumor and legend, stories so old and so embellished that the truth is buried beyond recovery. And in some cases, that's fair. But several of his most significant confrontations are documented in precise, credible detail, with multiple witnesses, and they reveal something about who Bruce Lee actually was that his films, despite their brilliance, never quite captured. When he arrived in Seattle, he began teaching martial arts almost immediately, first out of cramped spaces and eventually at a small school he opened himself. The demonstrations he gave attracted attention, and that attention attracted challenges. One of the earliest documented confrontations in America involved a young man named Yoichi Nokochi, described by Bruce's first American student, Jesse Glover, as a second-degree black belt with training in both karate and judo. During one of Bruce's presentations, Bruce had been openly critical of what he saw as the limitations of hard-style martial arts, like karate, arguing that rigid stylistic thinking made practitioners less effective, not more. Nokochi took this personally. He pushed for a fight. Bruce initially ignored him. Then Nokochi kept pushing, and Bruce agreed. They squared off at a IMCA in downtown Seattle. Nokochi came with supporters. Bruce brought his students. The fight was brief in a way that makes you want to rewind it and watch it again. Nokochi threw a front kick. Bruce deflected it and moved inside the reach, launching a rapid sequence of chain punches, a Wing Chun staple, that drove Nokochi across the room and into a wall. Nokochi tried to grab him. Bruce was already somewhere else. The fight ended in seconds. Jesse Glover later told Black Belt magazine that the left side of Nokochi's face showed the unmistakable signs of having been hit with concentrated, repeated force. Nokochi was unconscious. People standing nearby reportedly weren't sure for a moment whether he was going to wake up at all. And Bruce, by Glover's account, was utterly, eerily calm about it. Not triumphant, not angry, just done. This was characteristic. Bruce Lee did not fight to prove himself to audiences. When he fought to settle specific questions with specific people. And when those questions were answered, he moved on. He reportedly asked those present to keep quiet about what happened. Not because he was ashamed of it, but because he simply didn't need the story to be told. The far more documented and historically significant confrontation came in 1964 in Oakland, California, and it changed the entire direction of Bruce Lee's martial arts life. Bruce had been teaching in Oakland for some time by then, opening the doors of his school to non-Chinese students, something that the Chinese martial arts establishment in San Francisco viewed as a serious breach. There was a deeply entrenched belief, going back generations, that the secrets of Kung Fu were to be kept within the Chinese community. What Bruce was doing violated that tradition completely, and it made people angry in ways that went beyond simple cultural protectiveness into something that looked more like territorial fury. A man named David Chin delivered a letter to Bruce's school one day. The letter, written in Cantonese, came from affiliates of the Jiu-Jitsu Academy. It challenged Bruce to fight a Kung Fu practitioner named Wong Jackman, a fellow Wing Chun stylist who ran his own school nearby. The stated reason for the challenge was Bruce's teaching of Kung Fu to non-Chinese students. Bruce read the letter and laughed. Then he agreed. The accounts of what happened next are genuinely contested, even today. Wong Jackman later maintained that he went in with the intention of a controlled demonstration match, not a no-holds-barred confrontation. Bruce made no such distinction. His wife Linda was present and described Bruce immediately going on the offensive. The moment the fight began, driving Wong around the room, chasing him when he tried to create distance, finally pinning him to the ground and demanding a verbal submission. What is less disputed is that the fight lasted several minutes, longer than Bruce wanted, longer than he felt it should have, and that fact gnawed at him afterward with an intensity that is remarkable to contemplate. He had won. There was no serious question about that. But he had not won the way he believed he should have been able to win. He was out of breath. His technique had not been crisp and lethal. It had been effective but labored. Something was wrong with his approach. Something needed to be rethought from the ground up. That dissatisfaction was the seed of Jeet Kune Do. There were other fights on film sets. Witnesses describe Bruce responding to challenges from extras and stuntmen on multiple occasions, ending those confrontations with a single technique, usually a side kick or a rapid straight punch, before returning to work, as if nothing had happened. Bob Wall, who appeared in Enter the Dragon and became a close friend of Bruce's, described watching him dismantle a challenger with what Wall called a single explosive movement. The challenger, Wall said, quite literally catapulted off Bruce's fist and hit the floor, then got up, shook Bruce's hand, and left. There are accounts of road rage incidents in Los Angeles, of gangsters trying to intimidate people on his film sets in Hong Kong and learning very quickly that this was a poor choice of target. There are accounts from his time in Seattle of confrontations in pool halls and parking lots that Bruce navigated alongside his early students. In almost every case, the pattern is the same. Bruce did not seek the fight. He did not escalate. But when someone chose the moment, he ended it with an efficiency and a finality that left the people who witnessed it struggling to describe exactly what they had seen. What makes all of this matter beyond mere legend is the context. Bruce Lee was not a large man. He weighed approximately 130 pounds for most of his adult life. The people challenging him were often significantly larger, and in some cases trained professionals in their own right. The force asymmetry he demonstrated, the ability to generate the kind of stopping power that his body mass, by conventional physics, had no business producing, was something that even trained fighters who witnessed it could not fully explain. The only time he entered an official, rules-based competition, an amateur boxing tournament at King George V School in Hong Kong in 1958, he knocked out the returning champion, Gary Elms, in 3 rounds, using a combination of Wing Chun trapping techniques and straight punches. He won comfortably, and he walked away frustrated, because the rules had prevented him from doing what he actually knew how to do. That is Bruce Lee in a single image, always frustrated by the limits of the frame he was given, always convinced there was a better, more efficient way, always right. Part 3. The machine that tried to keep him out. In 1964, a martial arts demonstration changed everything. Ed Parker, the founder of American Kempo Karate, organized the Long Beach International Karate Championships in California. Bruce Lee was invited to demonstrate some of his techniques. He showed the 1-inch punch, the 2-finger push-ups, his blinding straight punch speed. The crowd was stunned. And in that crowd was a Hollywood hairstylist named Jay Sebring, who happened to be a friend of television producer William Dozier. Dozier was developing a new ABC series called The Green Hornet. He needed a sidekick for the lead character, a masked crime fighter named Britt Reed. The sidekick was Kato, a vaguely Asian character who served as driver and martial arts expert. Dozier saw the footage of Bruce at Long Beach and called him in for a screen test. Bruce went into those meetings with his eyes completely open about what was being asked of him. He knew the landscape. He knew that Asian actors in Hollywood had, for decades, been offered exactly two types of roles: the emasculated, bowing, honorable servant, or the inscrutable, sinister foreign villain. He had no interest in either. When discussions began, he was direct about his terms. He told the producers, in his own words, that if the role was going to involve pigtails and hopping around with buck teeth, he wasn't interested. He insisted that Kato be portrayed as a human being, a partner, not a prop. He got some of what he wanted. Kato was given a voice, given dignity, given fight scenes that allowed Bruce to actually demonstrate what he was capable of. And what he was capable of was immediately apparent to anyone watching. The Green Hornet ran on ABC from September 1966 to March 1967, 26 episodes. Cancelled after one season due to declining ratings. In Hong Kong, those same 26 episodes were rebroadcast under the title The Kato Show, because Hong Kong audiences had quickly realized that the most interesting person on screen was not the Green Hornet at all. But in America, despite the fact that viewers loved Bruce's scenes, despite the fact that Van Williams, who played the Green Hornet, reportedly asked to be taught some of Bruce's moves, despite the fan mail and the clearly demonstrated star power, the network and the studio could not figure out how to build a career around him. He was too Chinese for America, and, as his wife Linda later noted with sad irony, too American for Hong Kong. Pay stubs from the Green Hornet, which his daughter Shannon Lee later examined, showed him paid far less than his co-stars, despite being the breakout element of the show. And after its cancellation, Bruce spent the next several years doing guest appearances, bit parts, teaching private martial arts lessons to people like Steve McQueen, James Coburn, and Sharon Tate, and trying to find a path forward that didn't require him to either disappear into stereotypes or disappear from the screen entirely. The most devastating professional blow came in the form of a television series called Kung Fu. The show's creators, Ed Spielman and Howard Friedlander, developed a concept about a half-Chinese, half-American Shaolin monk wandering through the American West in the 1870s. The character was named Kwai Chang Caine, and Bruce Lee, the only man alive who was literally a half-Chinese, half-Western Kung Fu master who had grown up navigating both cultures from the inside, went in and auditioned for the role. He did not get it. Tom Kuhn, head of Warner Brothers television division, later cited Bruce's accent as the problem. He said audiences might have difficulty understanding him. He also made the argument that the character of Caine required a quality of serenity, of detachment, that Bruce did not possess. The role went to David Carradine, a white actor with, at the time of his casting, no martial arts training whatsoever. None. He had been a dancer. He learned to approximate the movements of Kung Fu during production. Now here is where the story becomes genuinely contested, and where being careful about accuracy matters. The question of whether the Kung Fu series itself was based on an idea Bruce had pitched, his proposed Western about a Chinese martial artist in America, eventually titled The Warrior, remains actively debated by serious researchers. The The most authoritative biography of Bruce Lee, written by Matthew Polly and published in 2018, argues that the timeline does not support the idea that Spielman plagiarized Bruce's concept. Spielman's own deep interest in Asian culture predated any contact with Bruce's ideas, and he developed his treatment independently. What is not debated is this: Bruce Lee auditioned for the role of Kwai Chang Caine, the character, who was explicitly half Chinese. He was rejected in favor of a white actor. He publicly acknowledged this in a Canadian television interview shortly afterward, saying that this kind of thing existed in the world, and that it was why certain projects of his were not moving forward. He called it what it was. There is also the matter of the film The Silent Flute, which Bruce had spent years developing with his friends James Coburn and writer Sterling Siliphant. The project was a deeply personal artistic statement about the nature of martial arts and self-discovery, the kind of philosophical, action-driven cinema that Bruce had been building toward his entire career. They scouted locations together in India. They refined the script. And then Hollywood didn't want it. The project died. Siliphant eventually made a version of it years later without Bruce, starring, in a particularly raw twist, David Carradine. By 1970, Bruce Lee, one of the most naturally gifted screen presences Hollywood had seen in a generation, could not get a leading role in an American film. He returned to Hong Kong. Part 4. What they tried to suppress, and why it terrified them here, is the thing about Bruce Lee that tends to get lost in the noise of the fights and the films and the posthumous mythology. He was a genuinely radical thinker, not in an abstract, theoretical sense, but in a way that had real, immediate consequences for entrenched power structures. His martial arts philosophy, the system he called Jeet Kune Do, which he formally named in 1967, was not simply a new fighting style. It was a direct, sustained attack on the foundational assumptions of every established martial arts tradition in the world. Traditional styles, Bruce argued, were not systems for developing effective fighters. They had become systems for developing obedient students. The forms, the rituals, the rigid hierarchies of rank and style, these were not preserving something true. They were protecting something comfortable, something that gave schools and masters and institutions their power. He went further. He argued that any style, by definition, was already a limitation. The moment you committed to being a karate man, or a Wing Chun man, or a judo man, you had agreed to see every situation through that single lens. And reality, Bruce pointed out with the blunt logic of someone who had been in actual fights, does not care about your style. His approach was radically simple. Absorb what is useful, discard what is not, add what is essentially your own. He studied boxing, fencing, Muay Thai, wrestling, judo, jiu-jitsu, taking the mechanics that worked and integrating them into a fluid, adaptable framework that had no fixed form, because its only fixed principle was effectiveness. He studied footage of Muhammad Ali for hours, analyzing his footwork. He corresponded with athletes and coaches across disciplines. He was, decades before the concept had a name, the first mixed martial artist. The establishment hated this. The Chinese martial arts community in San Francisco had already demonstrated how seriously they took violations of tradition when they challenged Bruce specifically, because he was teaching non-Chinese students. Traditional karate, kung fu, and judo schools resented the implication that their painstakingly developed systems contained inefficiencies and dead weight. The martial arts world is not, historically speaking, a community that has welcomed people telling them their emperor has no clothes. What Bruce was doing was not merely technical. It was philosophical in the deepest sense. He was teaching people to think for themselves, to question authority, to test claims rather than simply accept them, in a discipline built on deference, on the absolute authority of the master, on the absolute supremacy of the style. This was genuinely threatening. His paper Liberate Yourself from Classical Karate, published in Black Belt magazine in 1971, was an explicit provocation. He wrote that classical martial arts were, in many cases, elaborate ceremonial performance divorced from functional combat, that styles separate men, because they have their own doctrines, and then the doctrine becomes gospel truth, that you cannot change. He argued for experimentation, for heresy, for the abandonment of systems that no longer serve the purpose they claimed to serve. Traditionalists were furious. Some dismissed him, some challenged him. The ones who actually got close enough to test their objections physically found themselves on the floor, faster than they could complete the thought. But the suppression was not only from within the martial arts world, it came from Hollywood too, in the form of active exclusion. When Bruce tried to carry his philosophy into mainstream American culture, not just the fighting techniques but the ideas underneath them, the Taoist concepts of formlessness and flow, the radical equality of people regardless of race or style, Hollywood consistently refused to give him the platform to do it. They would let him be a sidekick, a supporting character, an exotic presence who could do impressive physical things in service of a white lead story. They would not let him be the center. They would not let him speak his actual philosophy, at length on screen, in English, to an American audience. They would not let him be, in other words, what he actually was, a man of profound intelligence and charisma who happened to be Chinese, who had important things to say, who deserved to be heard as a full human being. The irony is almost unbearable. The system that Bruce Lee was dismantling in his martial arts teaching, the system of rigid hierarchies that placed certain people above others based not on ability or truth but on tradition and gatekeeping, was the exact same system that Hollywood was running when it looked at him and saw a sidekick. Part 5. Hong Kong and the eruption that Hollywood couldn't control. When Bruce returned to Hong Kong in 1970, he went back as something of a defeated man, at least by the standards of what he had been trying to accomplish. He had spent nearly a decade trying to break through in American film and television. He had the talent, the charisma, the physicality, and the ideas. Hollywood had given him Kato. What happened next is one of the most dramatic reversals in entertainment history. In Hong Kong, the 26 episodes of The Green Hornet had been running under the name The Kato Show. Bruce Lee, who had been to Asian for America, was a star in his home city. He was recognized everywhere. He was mobbed on the street. And a producer named Raymond Chow, who had recently started an independent production company called Golden Harvest in direct competition with the dominant Shaw Brothers studio, saw something that everyone in Los Angeles had been too locked into their assumptions to see: an international star in waiting. Chow offered Bruce the lead in a film called The Big Boss, to be shot in Thailand on a budget that was modest even by Hong Kong standards. Bruce agreed. The film was shot in difficult conditions. The heat was brutal. The locations were remote. The schedule was punishing. The Big Boss opened in Hong Kong in 1971. It broke every box office record the city had ever seen. People lined up around the block. The film had to be held over week after week. Golden Harvest immediately began developing a follow-up. Fist of Fury was released in 1972, and it did what felt impossible. It exceeded The Big Boss at the box office. Then came The Way of the Dragon, which Bruce wrote, directed, produced, and starred in, his most complete personal artistic statement up to that point, including the legendary fight sequence at the Roman Colosseum that he staged illegally after hours with Chuck Norris. Each film surpassed the previous one. Each film demonstrated something new about what Bruce Lee could do. When given real control over his own story, Hollywood finally paid attention. Warner Brothers came to the table. The result was Enter the Dragon, the first Hollywood-Hong Kong co-production, the first Hollywood film with an Asian American in the lead role. It was completed in the spring of 1973. Its release date was set, and Bruce Lee, the man who had spent years being told he was not marketable enough for American audiences, was 3 weeks away from proving everyone wrong when he died. Part 6. The death that still has no official explanation. On July 20, 1973, the hottest day of that month in Hong Kong, Bruce Lee died at the age of 32. Here is what is known with certainty. In the afternoon, he met with his producer Raymond Chow, and they discussed upcoming projects, including a film they planned to make with Australian actor George Lazenby. Later, Bruce drove with Chow to the apartment of actress Betty Ting Pei. He spent time there. He complained of a headache. Betty gave him a tablet of Equagesic, a combination painkiller made of aspirin and the sedative meprobamate that he had taken before without issue. He lay down to rest before dinner. When Betty went to wake him 2 hours later, he was unresponsive. An ambulance was called. He was taken to a hospital. He never woke up. The official time of death was 11:30 p.m. The autopsy revealed cerebral edema, swelling of the brain, the same condition that had hospitalized him 2 months earlier, in May 1973, when he had collapsed during a voice recording session for Enter the Dragon. That first episode had been dramatic and frightening. Convulsions, loss of consciousness, vomiting, emergency hospitalization. He had recovered. Doctors in the United States had examined him thoroughly afterward and cleared him to work. What killed him the second time? Even now, 50 years later, there is no definitive scientific consensus. The official verdict returned by the Hong Kong coroner was death by misadventure. Cerebral edema caused by a hypersensitivity reaction to compounds in the Equagesic tablet. The pathologist who conducted the autopsy, a highly respected British forensic expert recommended by Scotland Yard, who had overseen more than 1,000 autopsies, concluded that the drug reaction had triggered the brain swelling that killed him. But problems with this explanation have been raised repeatedly by medical researchers. Bruce had taken Equagesic many times before with no adverse effects. The drug's components, aspirin and meprobamate, are not typically associated with this kind of catastrophic reaction. The official explanation requires us to believe that a medication he had tolerated without difficulty suddenly caused fatal cerebral swelling, for no clearly identifiable reason. In 2018, author Matthew Polly, whose biography of Bruce Lee is considered the most authoritative and thoroughly researched account of his life, consulted with medical experts and proposed a different explanation. Heat stroke. Polly noted that July 20th was documented as the hottest day of that month in Hong Kong. Bruce had been physically active throughout the day in extreme heat. And then there is the issue of his sweat glands. In late 1972, Bruce Lee had undergone a surgical procedure to remove the sweat glands from his armpits. His stated reason was cosmetic. He didn't want sweat stains appearing on camera. The procedure was real. It is documented. And sweat glands, of course, are not decorative. They are a primary mechanism by which the human body regulates its core temperature. In extreme heat, with exertion, a person whose ability to sweat has been surgically compromised is at measurably higher risk. Hypothermia. Polly's argument is that Bruce had already suffered one heat-related episode in May, the collapse at the recording studio, and that his body, still vulnerable from that event, was pushed past its limit again in July. The fact that heat stroke was poorly understood as a medical condition in 1973 means it was not considered as a cause at the inquest, which could easily account for the coroner's reliance on the drug reaction theory. In 2022, a paper published in the Clinical Kidney Journal proposed yet another hypothesis: hyponatremia, or water intoxication. The researchers argued that Bruce had multiple known risk factors for his kidneys' inability to properly excrete excess water, including chronic high fluid intake, the use of certain prescription medications, his period of eating almost nothing but juice before his death, and possibly the cannabis he consumed that afternoon, which increases thirst. The resulting buildup of excess water in the bloodstream can trigger the exact kind of cerebral swelling found in his autopsy. There is a grim irony in this theory that has not gone unnoticed. Bruce Lee was famous for his be water philosophy, the idea that the ideal state of a human being, like water, is to have no fixed form, to adapt to any container, to be impossible to grasp. The idea that he may have died from too much water is either a coincidence or the universe's most heavy-handed metaphor. What none of the credible theories involve is assassination. No triads. No ninja poisoners. No ancient curses. Every serious researcher who has examined the evidence concludes that Bruce Lee died as a result of some combination of the physiological vulnerabilities he had accumulated through his extraordinary training regimen, the surgical choices he made, the environmental conditions of that particular day, and medication that interacted badly with all of the above. The tragedy is not that he was killed. The tragedy is that the accumulation of extreme choices made in pursuit of perfection, in service of an art he loved with everything he had, ultimately contributed to his death. He burned so hot that he burned out. Part 7. Brandon. And the weight of a name. Bruce Lee died when his son Brandon was 8 years old. Brandon Bruce Lee grew up with a name that was both a gift and a gravitational field. He was his father's child in every way that mattered. The physical gifts, the presence, the refusal to take the smaller path when a harder, truer one existed. He trained in martial arts under his father's students. He became an actor. He tried, with a real and visible effort, to build a career that was his own, rather than simply a tribute or a continuation of what his father had started. He said in interviews that he did not want to be remembered as the son of Bruce Lee. He wanted to make his own mark. He chose roles deliberately, looking for projects that would let him grow dramatically, that would expand his range and his reputation beyond action. By 1993, he had found what seemed to be the perfect vehicle, a film called The Crow, based on a dark and powerful graphic novel about a rock musician murdered alongside his fiancée, who returns from the dead to seek justice. It was gothic, it was dark, it was emotionally complex in ways that action films rarely permitted. He was 28 years old. He had 8 days of filming left before the production would wrap. He was engaged to be married 2 weeks after completion. On March 31, 1993, at approximately 12:30 in the morning, Brandon Lee was filming the scene in which his character is shot and killed. Another actor fired a gun at him from 15 to 20 feet away. The gun was supposed to be loaded with blanks, but during previous filming, a dummy cartridge, used for close-up shots of the gun being loaded, had been improperly prepared, resulting in a real bullet being lodged partway in the barrel. When the blank was fired, the propellant charge drove that lodged bullet out with the force of a live round. Brandon Lee was struck in the abdomen. 2 arteries were severed immediately. He was rushed to the hospital. After 6 hours of emergency surgery, he died at 1:04 in the afternoon. The investigation concluded that the death was the result of negligence on the part of the film's production crew. No criminal charges were ever filed. The verdict was accident, and by every credible account, that is exactly what it was, a preventable, catastrophic accident born of cost-cutting and carelessness that cost a young man who had everything to live for his entire future. His mother, Linda Lee, supported completing the film in his honor, using stunt doubles Chad Stahelski and Jeff Codiente, with Brandon's face digitally composited over theirs in key scenes. The Crow was finished and released in 1994. It remains, to this day, one of the most powerful and melancholy viewing experiences in cinema, not for anything cinematic in the conventional sense, but because of the way every frame feels haunted by the knowledge of what it cost to create. Brandon Lee was buried next to his father at Lakeview Cemetery in Seattle, Washington, a stone's throw apart, the same city, the same ground. The father who never got to be old, the son who never got to be middle-aged. The conspiracy theories emerged almost immediately after Brandon's death, as they had after Bruce's. The same dark logic was applied. Both men died young. Both died before the peak of what they might have accomplished. Both died under circumstances that had unusual elements. The theories ranged from Chinese organized crime to ancient curses to coordinated assassination. They persist to this day in certain corners of the internet. But the more accurate and more heartbreaking account is simpler. 2 men, a father and a son, were killed by the accumulation of specific failures, medical, physiological, procedural, that had nothing supernatural about them at all. They were killed by choices and accidents and the particular fragility that lives inside even the most extraordinary human bodies. Part 8. What could not be suppressed. Everything that Hollywood tried to contain about Bruce Lee. Everything that the martial arts establishment tried to suppress. Everything that racism tried to diminish. It came back. It always comes back when the thing being suppressed is true. The concept he developed, that a fighter who commits to no fixed style can adapt to any style, and therefore beat any style, became the foundational philosophy of the most commercially successful martial arts promotion in human history. In 2004, President Dana White said publicly that Bruce Lee was the father of mixed martial arts. He was not being poetic. He was being accurate. Every principle that drives modern the blending of striking and grappling, the rejection of stylistic dogma, the emphasis on what works over what is traditional, is a direct expression of ideas that Bruce Lee was teaching in his Oakland school in 1964. Georges St. Pierre quoted him. Anderson Silva cited him as inspiration. Conor McGregor has compared himself to him. John Jones has spoken about his influence. Manny Pacquiao said he tried to emulate Bruce's speed and quickness throughout his early career. Sugar Ray Leonard said he perfected his jab by studying Bruce Lee's technique. The fighters who carry his influence extend far beyond any single weight class or combat sport. They span the entire global fighting community. The films that Hollywood refused to give him. His Hong Kong films broke records that stood for years. Enter the Dragon, the one Hollywood film he completed, became one of the most profitable martial arts films ever made, and launched his international stardom in a wave that crested immediately after his death and has never fully receded. The industry that told him American audiences would not accept an Asian man in a leading role was proven wrong so completely and so publicly that it stands as one of the clearest demonstrations of Hollywood's racial blind spots in the 20th century. The ideas he put into The Warrior, his concept for a television series about a Chinese martial artist in America, were finally realized 45 years after his death, when his daughter Shannon Lee brought the project to Cinemax and HBO as the show Warrior, which premiered in 2019. The show exists because Shannon found her father's notes and treatment among his papers, and refused to let the vision die with the man who had created it. His philosophical writing, compiled after his death into the book Tao of Jeet Kune Do, is read not just by martial artists but by athletes, coaches, philosophers, and people with no particular interest in fighting at all, who have found in his words a framework for thinking about growth, limitation, and self-expression that applies to everything from creative work to personal development, to the way you approach a difficult conversation with someone you love. The quote that Hong Kong protesters adopted during the 2019 demonstrations, "Be water, my friend," was not chosen because it was a famous martial arts aphorism. It was chosen because it captured a way of thinking about resistance, about adaptability, about refusing to give power to structures that try to confine you. Bruce Lee's ideas, which emerged from his experiences of being confined, excluded, underestimated, and eventually suppressed by multiple power structures simultaneously, became a language of liberation for people he never met, in circumstances he never imagined. You cannot suppress a truth by refusing to give it a platform. You can delay it. You can make the person who carries it fight harder than they should have to fight. You can cost them years and energy and opportunities that should have been theirs automatically. But you cannot make the truth go away. Not when someone carries it with the kind of conviction that Bruce Lee carried it. And especially not when that truth is as deeply, demonstrably correct as his was. Part 9. The legacy that would not stay buried 52 years after his death. Bruce Lee is present in ways that defy easy accounting. His face appears on murals in cities on every inhabited continent. His statue stands in Hong Kong, overlooking the harbor. A second statue was erected in Mostar, Bosnia and Herzegovina, a city divided by ethnic conflict, because local citizens chose him as a symbol of unity that transcended the boundaries, tearing their community apart. He was, they noted, a man who had refused the boundaries others tried to draw around him his entire life. He seemed like the right choice. Every major fighting game franchise has a character based on him. The Street Fighter series, Mortal Kombat, Tekken. The foundational DNA of the entire genre traces back to Enter the Dragon, the first beat 'em up video game. Kung Fu Master in 1984 was based directly on Game of Death. Parkour practitioners in France have cited his philosophy as an influence on how they approach movements through urban environments. Shannon Lee, his daughter, has spent decades working to preserve and extend his legacy through the Bruce Lee Foundation and its educational programs, pushing back against the industry's tendency to reduce her father to a collection of iconic images and fighting moves stripped of the philosophical context that gave them meaning. She has fought, in ways that would make him proud, to keep the man visible behind the myth. The thing about Bruce Lee is that what made him genuinely dangerous, and I use that word carefully and precisely, was never physical. His kicks were extraordinary. His speed was bewildering. His physical conditioning represented something that sports scientists still find difficult to fully account for. But none of that was what truly threatened the structures that spent so long trying to contain him. What threatened them was the idea that you do not have to accept a category someone else has put you in. The idea that a system built on tradition deserves exactly as much respect as the tradition has earned, not one drop more and not one drop less. The idea that the best fighter is not the one with the most impressive style, but the one who can see clearly enough to respond to what is actually happening, without the filter of preconception. The idea that the limitations we accept become the walls of our actual lives. He lived that idea with a consistency that cost him. He paid for it in doors that stayed closed and roles that went to less qualified men, and years of being told, in the politely institutional language that power uses when it is unwilling to simply say no, that there just wasn't room for what he was offering. And then he went to Hong Kong and blew the doors off anyway. Be water, my friend. Not because water is soft, because water finds every crack, because water cannot be permanently stopped, because water, given time, will move through anything. He did. If this story moved you, if it showed you something about Bruce Lee that you hadn't seen before, or if it reminded you of something you already knew and needed to hear again, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. There is so much more of this history to explore, and every story we tell together is another piece of the real picture, the one that exists behind the carefully maintained myths. Share this with someone who thinks they already know the Bruce Lee story, because there is almost certainly something in here that will surprise them. We'll see you in the next one.